All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. We are continuing to read High Rises by Ben Austen. We are starting part 3 of this book called Rotations on the Land, and we are on chapter 12. Dolores Wilson. Vince Lane showed up at Dolores Wilson's church in February 1993 to talk about the impending demolition at Cabrini-Green. He said change was coming. Dantrell Davis's death, 4 months earlier, guaranteed it. High rises were going to be torn down. 2 of the 23 towers had already been cleared of tenants and boarded up. The world of gangs and drugs had to go. 40 residents had come to hear him at Holy Family, and Lane wanted them to understand that all the attention from Dantrell's murder also meant there were tens of millions of federal dollars available to rebuild. Lane asked the tenants to partner with him in making the new Cabrini-Green. He promised that nothing would be done without their input and approval. To give a sense of what a revamped Cabrini might look like, Lane pointed to what he'd done at Lake Park Place, a public housing development on the south side. 4 of the 6 high-rises along the lakefront were vacated and eventually demolished. In the 2 rehab towers, only half of the apartments were designated as public housing. The rest were rented at slightly subsidized rates to working-class and middle-class families. When the 2 15-story buildings reopened in 1991, all 282 apartments were filled, with public housing recipients and better-off renters living next to each other on every floor. The rehab resulted in a net loss of more than 550 units of public housing. But Lake Park Place was now livable, Lane explained. You had people of varying incomes who wanted to live there. Quote, high-rises weren't the problem at Cabrini-Green, end quote, he said. Quote, rich people all around them live in high-rise apartment buildings. The problem was the high concentration of poverty, end quote. Lane was a visionary. He could see where public housing policy in the country was headed. Only a couple of years earlier, Jack Kemp, the head of HUD under George H.W. Bush, said he refused to be remembered as the, quote, Secretary of Demolition, end quote. Kemp had founded the Federal Hope Initiative not to tear down high-rises, but to hand over responsibility for the properties to the people who lived there. Hope stood originally for home ownership and opportunity for people everywhere, but over the next decades, HUD would award cities tens of billions of dollars in Hope 6 grants to knock down their public housing high-rises and replace them with mixed-income developments like Lake Park Place. Demolition became something that local and federal politicians embraced proudly. While public housing was, quote, never more than half alive, end quote, as Catherine Bauer called it, the aversion to entitlement programs would come to rule ever more deeply in the American mainstream. After winning a majority of seats of Congress in 1994, Republicans said they planned to scrap the entire Department of Housing and Urban Development. President Clinton, touting its cuts to the welfare system and proclaiming that the, quote, era of big government is over, end quote, preemptively reorganized HUD. The agency promised to, quote, infuse market discipline, end quote, into public housing. Excuse me. A new law mandated that any large public housing development with a vacancy rate of over 10% undergo a test to determine whether a rehab made sense economically. Of the 100,000 units across the country that failed, 6 of them were in Chicago, a total of 18,500 apartments, twice as many as in any other city. At Cabrini, only the row houses passed. Congress then voted to end the requirement that cities add a unit of public housing for every one torn down, ushering in the era of widespread demolition. By 1999, HUD would boast that Hope 6 had eliminated 50,000 units of public housing nationwide. A decade later, the number had doubled. Every city got in on the action: Philadelphia, Atlanta, Baltimore, Newark. But none would knock down as many as Chicago. Mixed-income developments like Lake Park Place, with their blended populations and low densities, could house only a small percentage of those who had lived in the demolished public housing high-rises. But these new developments would also serve the purpose of clearing the slums, replacing the same public housing buildings that were used to clear the slums of a half-century before. The majority of residents leaving public housing were given vouchers to find apartments on their own. The Section 8 program allows cities to move away from building and operating actual public housing complexes. The government would instead pay private landlords to rent to qualifying families. By 2000, the CHA was calling itself a, quote, facilitator of housing opportunities, end quote, and its holdings would include 48,000 vouchers and half as many actual public housing units. The rents the government paid to Section 8 landlords in Chicago were based on an average of the city as a whole, meaning too little for a home in a diverse neighborhood with strong schools and low crime, but, it turned out, somewhat more than the asking price of a place in an overwhelmingly black and poor neighborhood. Landlords in these areas saw a profit in a guaranteed government check, and so the solution for high-rise public housing would also recreate some of its same mistakes. Many of the families relocated with vouchers ended up in areas almost as uniformly black and poor as the government housing they left. Vince Lane couldn't know how vehemently Cabrini-Green residents would fight to save their tragic home over the next quarter century, or who among them would get to stay on the land in new mixed-income buildings, or what would happen to those who were dispersed. But he knew that the name Cabrini-Green was a catalyst for the change to come. He announced as he prepared the $50 million grant application for the first phase of the development's overhaul, quote, Cabrini symbolizes all that is wrong with public housing, end quote. The residents of 1230 North Burling who listened to Lane were unmoved by his mixed-income vision for Cabrini-Green. Their building had the same high concentration of poor and black families as the other towers, and yet they were already partners in its restoration. HUD had awarded 1230 North Burling Resident Management Corporation $6.8 million to oversee a full-scale renovation of the high-rise. They were getting a new roof, new pipes, and trash chutes, a new heating system. They were replacing all the windows and rehabbing every apartment, and like anyone renovating a home, Dolores Wilson and the other managers obsessed over the details. They selected colors and styles, changing their minds 10 times before settling on their picks. Blinds, white Levolor, tile, mauve vinyl, elevator entrance, terracotta, exterior facade, eggshell. They interviewed engineers, contractors, and suppliers. They devised a 5-phase renovation schedule with families slated to move temporarily into rehab vacant apartments in the building while their own units were completed. Bertha Gilkey warned them that they needed to document how every cent was spent, since people were going to assume that they were incompetent or, worse, thieves. If the renovation was over budget or shoddily done, the residents were sure to be blamed. Quote, I was scared, end quote, Dolores would say. Quote, I figured we were going to mess up on this or that, end quote. So it was a milestone worthy of jubilation when their resident management corporation finalized its very first construction contract in 1992 for the installation of the weather-sealing double-pane windows and the repair of the tower's exterior concrete. Dolores wrote in the flyer announcing the celebration, quote, this ceremony would symbolize the success of the RMC's hard work, cooperative spirit, and participation in the comprehensive modernization program, end quote. As further proof of how much they'd accomplished, she'd included in the invite the contract number for the work and its dollar amount, $1,274,000. The general contractor that Dolores helped pick came highly recommended. Shaw Engineering had numerous jobs with the city and state. When the work progressed slower than scheduled, When the work progressed slower than scheduled, the firm's owner, Manu Shah, assured her that there was always unforeseen delays. He said his crew had discovered lead-based paint in many of the apartments. The craftspeople he hired explained as well about cockroaches, saying they weren't paid to be exterminators. When Shah bid on the project, he and his subcontractors had to detail how they would hire residents. People from the building wanted to work. Dolores and her team readied them, sending residents to training sessions, giving them tips on how to be interviewed, and submitting their names to the CHA and HUD. But the contractors and subcontractors came up with excuses for why they didn't hire more people from the list provided. One morning, when the painters and drywallers showed up for work, a group of residents barred their entrance into the building. The tenants were shutting down the work site until the contract was honored. Days passed, and then weeks. The CHA assigned an official to mediate the dispute. Shah agreed to another round of interviews. One subcontractor hired 6 additional tenants. The roofer took on 2 residents at $13.57 an hour. Working on the building resumed. A few years later, After a long federal investigation, Manu Shah pleaded guilty to bilking the city and state out of $10 million. His engineering firm had been awarded more than 60 government contracts with Chicago alone, and it was caught overcharging on the jobs. The residents of 1230 North Berlin could only shake their heads. Quote, "That's Chicago," end quote, they say. They've seen it before. But as far as the renovations of their building went, Dolores and her neighbors were thrilled with the results. Amid the public outcry to tear down Cabrini-Green, their high-rise looked new. The outside walls were restored to the color of creamy vanilla, the mechanicals were updated, and Dolores loved her new kitchen and weather-sealing double-pane windows. Quote, "Everyone wanted to move into the Berlin," end quote, she say. The building didn't just look good. For the residents, it was a monument to what could be accomplished when they were given the power to shape their own lives. Quote, "I wish Oprah had said, 'There are no children here,'" end quote, Dolores would pronounce. The Alex Kolowitz bestseller about the Horner homes had been made into a television movie starring Oprah Winfrey as the mother of Lafayette and Pharaoh Rivers. Quote, "We would have been all over her," end quote, Dolores went on. Quote, "Children still live here," end quote. Okay, and that brings us to a changing in the theme within this chapter, and as what seems to be happening in this next section that we're reading now that we're in the early 90s, 92, 93 time span, it seems that politics in the country has changed, and that's one of the things that I think is very important to speak about too. The people that are the most vulnerable in our country, in our society, are people whose lives are greatly determined by what the politics of the time are. And so when the politics of the time were slavery, the most vulnerable people being black people, Africans that were brought over, the politics of the time deemed them to be slaves. When the politics of the time was, it's still very patriarchal, but was a different kind of patriarchal and misogynistic, and women couldn't vote, and women couldn't hold office, women couldn't own property. The women who were the most vulnerable in the society at that time were the ones whose lives were the most greatly changed by the politics of the time. Same thing with Jim Crow, same thing for the genocide that took place on the land with indigenous people. And so once we get to the 20th century, capitalism has ballooned to such an extent that people are exploited at such heavy rates that it is an overwhelming amount of poverty that exists. And the people who are in this impoverished state are most vulnerable to whatever the politics become. So when the politics were Lyndon B. Johnson and trying to increase giving money to certain programs, whether it be school programs or poverty programs in general, they were benefited from that. And then when Ronald Reagan is not the direct following. When Richard Nixon takes office and there's a swing in the politics, and those programs begin to be cut, and a different type of political jargon begins to be used, a different type of political mind state begins to be implemented. Again, the people who are the most vulnerable, the poor people, working class people in the society, they're the people whose lives are the most greatly affected by that. The same thing happens when the crack epidemic, and the same thing happens when in the 90s when Clinton rises, giving funding to and puts the crime bill out and increases mass incarceration. We see how the people who are at the most vulnerable in our society are the ones whose lives are the most greatly changed from what the politics are of the time. And so until we get into a place where we have a politics of humaneness, a politic of justice, a politic of equity, we'll continue to see the people who are quote unquote at the bottom or the most vulnerable in our society receive the greatest damage from the inhumane politics and the unequitable and the unequal politics. One of the other things that is pointed out in here too is that you see the psychological trauma that exists for people in this situation, where they go from not having any power over things. Speaking about Dolores Wilson specifically, she lived in the tenements. The high rises was built. She was there at the beginning when the high rises were brand new, was a step up when people wanted to live there. It was different different income bracket incomes living there. The violence and the gang and the drugs weren't there at that extent. So she understands that it's possible for Cabrini-Green to exist in a certain manner, that in a manner that most people may not think is possible because they haven't seen it be done, or because they wasn't from there, or because they have some type of narrative or prejudice when they perceive Cabrini-Green. But she understands the capacity that Cabrini-Green has, and once power is, and she has memories here, she spent her life here, and once power is granted to her and granted to other people that were living there in Cabrini-Green, they were taking the steps forward that was needed to try to return it to what it once was, and to try to fulfill and try to get it back to the capacity that was once seen, and or get it back to the type of community or the type of culture that existed in it when they first moved in, or when Dolores first moved in. And so Dolores doesn't have a desire to give up on these on Cabrini-Green, and it is something that's pointed out in here where the CHA, the head of the CHA, who's involved in demolishing and getting ready to demolish the high rises, is saying that it's not about the high rises. That's not the reason that these issues exist. It's because of how much poverty has been pushed together in this one area, and but because the politics of the time has began to change, and when the politics of the time was to build a Cabrini-Green and build these big high-rises, they built them. When the politics of the time was to take resources from defund them resourcefully, and to not put as much care into the area as they did other areas of the city, that's what the politicians did. When the politics of the time meant that you had to make some type of grand gesture, as we've seen the mayor move in, and we've seen one mayor do a big sweep of the city, or a big sweep of Cabrini-Green, and that's what was done. And we see now the politics of the time is to destroy it. And in each one of these things, the people who live in these communities never have any say. They never have any power, truthfully, within themselves to determine the life that they're going to have in there. And we see that happening now, where they're going to tear these things down, and it's no matter how much of a fight these people could try to put up for them to not get torn down, it's a fight that they don't have the power to win. Let's see. Let's try to knock out another segment. In the first issue of Voices of Cabrini in April 1993, the newspaper's co-editor, Mark Pratt, welcomed readers by expounding on the publication's name. Quote, "How often have you sat and either watched a report on television or read an article in a newspaper about Cabrini-Green and said to yourself, I wish they had spoken to me, because you felt you had something to contribute or debate," end quote. 6 months had passed since Dantrell Davis's murder, and Pratt was sick of the police sweeps in his neighborhood being called out as a paragon of inner city horrors. He'd been a small child in 1972 when his family moved to the row houses, and he was ready to set the record straight on many things. He wrote of the homegrown gang truce, quote, "It is a well-acknowledged fact by some police officers within the Cabrini community that the peace treaty is really what has changed the safety of Cabrini, and not the stormtroopers or Nazi-like tactics of the lockdown," end quote. One contributor, addressing the imbalance in the media coverage of his home, wrote, quote, "When something bad does happen in Cabrini-Green and you do a story on it, please leave Dantrell Davis out of it. Let him rest in peace," end quote. Every 3 or 4 or 5 weeks, whenever an edition was completed, Voices of Cabrini would be filled with lists of graduates from the local public schools, tutoring programs, and GED classes. Updates on the Little League season, and congratulations to tenants like Natalie Howard of 911 North Hudson, who took first place in the playground safety contest. It included poems, movie reviews, and remembrances of those who'd passed. The paper shared tips on how to identify child abuse and how to deal with an infant who wouldn't sleep. Sidebars explained tenants' rights and provided information on the areas as churches and legal aid clinics. A lifetime Cabrini tenant reflecting on his journey into and out of addiction thanked local role models, notably Hubert Wilson, whose drum and bugle corps had inspired him to get clean and teach drums at Sojourner Truth Elementary. Quote, a family man, end quote, he wrote in memory of Dolores' husband, quote, who still took time to be an outside father to boys who didn't have a father, end quote. The newspaper grew out of an unexpected alliance between Cabrini-Green and the wealthy North Shore suburb of Winnetka. Peter Bendencroft, who operated a Chicago nonprofit focused on a civic engagement, made the match. As he followed the news of Dantrell Davis, he recalled a shooting that had occurred in Winnetka 4 years earlier. A 30-year-old woman named Lori Dan, after trying to poison dozens with arsenic, walked into an elementary school with 3 guns, shooting 6 and killing 1 child before taking her own life. The events led to a book, Murder of Innocents, and made for a television movie starring Valerie Bertinelli as the unhinged killer. Quote, school shooting, end quote, wasn't yet a thing, but Binkendorf imagined that Cabrini-Green and Winnetka shared an unexplored bond. He connected with Henrietta Thompson, a Cabrini tenant who'd assisted the Candyman producers when they filmed on location at the development. They drove out to Winnetka and met with a group of women who started a community newspaper following the Lori Dan incident as a form of therapy and a way to rebuild trust. At Cabrini, no one received grief counseling, not even Dantrell's young classmates, and residents were being told there was little there worth saving. Thompson liked the idea of the newspaper. Thompson and Pratt shared the editing responsibilities. Another 10 Cabrini residents joined the staff, and during the first year of publication, nearly 100 people from Cabrini-Green contributed. They laid out the pages at a nearby ad agency where Binkendorf had worked, printing 1,000 copies of each issue. Pratt borrowed a used car to deliver stacks of the papers to the high-rises and row houses, to local churches and community centers. Jimmy Williams, who as a teenager had been the drummer in the Electric Force Band, wrote a regular advice column, often of the tough love variety. Quote, peer pressure? What the hell is that? If you feel so low about yourself that you must follow the Joneses, lay down and die, end quote. Godfrey B., who grown up in public housing on the west side and owned a fast food seafood restaurant, wrote a cooking column called, quote, come and get it, end quote. He presented recipes for such dishes as spaghetti conquistador and Cabrini mustard and turnip greens. The reviewers who covered the music scene at Cabrini, quote, Chi-Town's capital hip-hop headquarters, end quote, mailed in his pieces from rural Illinois, 4 hours southwest of Chicago. K-So, who written lyrics for the Slick Boys, was in a state prison serving 5 years on a drug conviction. He managed to keep up with the trends. He rated Naughty by Nature's, quote, hip-hop parade, end quote, the, quote, dopest single of 1993, end quote. And what he couldn't verify from the penitentiary, he made up. Born Pete Keller in a section of the near north side neighboring Cabrini, he renamed himself, quote, K-So, end quote, at 12 for, quote, knowledge, strength, opportunity, end quote. As a teenager, he decided to make Cabrini-Green his home, residing over the years in the row houses in 21 of the 23 high-rises. He loved the public housing project. He hated it too, since many of the people he knew and cared about there ended up dead, in prison, or strung out, sometimes on the drugs he sold them. Quote, Cabrini-Green has layers, end quote, he say. Quote, Cabrini has so many fucked up multiple layers, end quote. In 1995, when Keller was paroled from prison, he hopped a Greyhound back to Chicago and finished out his sentence under house arrest in a Cabrini-Green high-rise. Voices of Cabrini had stalled by then, and K-So restarted the paper with the zeal of someone who thought about little else for 30 months in an 8x10 foot cell. In one of the many articles he wrote, he tried to make sense of a visit to Cabrini-Green by U.S. Congressman Christopher Shays, a Connecticut Republican who showed up at the housing complex unannounced over a Labor Day weekend. Ever since Jane Byrne's 3-week residency, numerous politicians have made a point of coming to Cabrini, usually to add grist to whatever housing or welfare reforms they were pushing. At 1230 North Burling, Dolores Wilson regularly toured congressmen and senators. She met Jack Kemp so many times, she said, that she was willing to switch over to the Republicans if it meant sending him to the White House. Quote, I don't care what Jesse Jackson or anyone else says, end quote, Dolores would say. Quote, I'm voting for Kemp because I know what he's for, end quote. Keller was happy to play host to Shays. Fair-skinned and straight-haired, K-So was raised by adoptive parents who were white, and at various times he lived as a white person, a black person, and a Latino. For these reasons, he thought of himself as a bridge between cultures and between Cabrini-Green and the outside world. He walked the congressman around the land at Cabrini, introducing him to residents. When Shays seemed eager to see more, K-So asked if he wanted to stay the night. Shays did. He slept on the couch in K-So's living room. Quote, honey, it's incredible. I'll tell you about it when I get home, whispered Christopher, as he overheard him calling home to his wife from an old payphone at the bottom of my building, end quote. Keller wrote, the two men spoke late into the night. Shays asked about living conditions and what sort of jobs people had and what the worst thing was that Keller had seen. Shays was a Republican who denounced federal control of public housing, a New York University MBA, a Christian Scientist who was still married to his childhood sweetheart. The guy seemed as foreign and inscrutable to Keller as the people at Cabrini must have come across to him. Quote, I wondered what he might have been thinking about us, his stay, future concerns, or if he just wanted to say that he spent the night in Cabrini-Green, end quote, Keller mused. The next morning, Shays thanked K-So for the hospitality. The couch he found comfortable, but he did have to ask about the thick fog of heat in the apartment, the lack of any circulating air. It was unbearable. Quote, how do you guys manage, end quote. The question seemed like a bit of life imitating the art of good times. In an episode of the sitcom, a white official from the housing authority calls on the Evans family and is shocked to find the elevator out of order. He can't catch his breath after hiking the 17 flights of stairs. He learns, too, that the heat isn't working, the refrigerator is broken, and no water is flowing from the taps. Quote, I hate to bring you people down, end quote, he says to the amused family. Quote, but it's awfully depressing to hear things like that, end quote. Then word reaches the Evans apartment that two gangs are fighting outside the towers, forcing the official to stay for dinner. Outraged to discover that nice people are suffering in these disgraceful conditions, he announces that he is going to bring changes. He's a top administrator at the district office, and he will make it happen. Quote, you have my word. Everything that's wrong in this building is going to be fixed, end quote. When the gang fight ends, he hurries out the door, promising over his shoulder that the Evans family should start to see repairs in 13 or 14 months. Keller didn't reply to Shays' questions, or at least he said he did it in the article, which he ends with an oddly revealing combination of conviction and doubt, a silencing of his Cabrini voice. He writes, quote, I wanted to comment, but I knew inside that he too knew the answer. Didn't he? End quote. And then that brings us to a changing in the theme of this chapter, and that brings us to about our 30-minute mark. So we'll wrap this episode up and finish this chapter next episode. I think what stands out to me, one of the things that stands out to me in that passage is this. I think this is one of the first times that counseling and therapy was something that's been brought up, and maybe it might not have been. It might not have struck with me or stuck with me like it did this time when reading it. But I think that that's something that should have been explored very early on. Is once these type of conditions were existing, every time there was attempts made to change these conditions and to deal with these conditions, is acknowledging that these people living in these conditions are struggling from post-traumatic stress syndrome, that these people are struggling from all types of mental crises that manifest because of the extreme living conditions that they are surrounded by, the amount of violence that they experience on a regular basis, the amount of psychological trauma that they experience on a daily basis, the amount of death that they're surrounded by. And I think that was something that, And that even exists still now. There are so many people who live in conditions and in situations where it's not simply just enough to remove them from the situation or remove the conditions or change the situation, but you have to also address what these situations and conditions have done to the people and to this person that's involved in it or that's situated in it. All right, and then we'll end this episode there, and then again we'll be back tomorrow for another episode of Rockford Reading Daily, High Risers by Ben Austin. Share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on. We outside.